The smoke was the first thing they noticed. Not from the settlement. Not from any of the 12 cabins lined up along the frozen creek bed. Each one burning twice the expected wood, each one losing ground to a cold that had arrived 6 weeks too early. The smoke was coming from the hillside, from the rocks, from a dark wound cut into the slope above the tree line, where a man no one wanted had gone to. Some said to die, others said to prove a point. No one went up to check on him. The temperature that first week of November had already dropped below what the oldest settlers remembered from mid-December. The green timber walls of the newer cabins leaked heat like open windows. Families burned through their first cord of wood before the month was half over. Children slept in coats. Dogs were let inside for the first time. And still, that thin line of smoke kept rising from the hillside. Steady, unhurried, as if whatever was burning up there had no reason to rush. That detail bothered people more than they admitted, because the man they had expelled 3 months earlier had gone up that hill with almost nothing. No milled lumber, no iron stove, no supply wagon. He had gone with hand tools, a canvas roll, and ideas that the settlement council had called dangerous nonsense, the kind of talk that gave false hope to families who needed to make real decisions about real materials. They had taken a vote. It was not close. What he had claimed before the vote was this: that the hill itself could be a furnace, that the stone could hold heat the way iron never could, that a man who understood how cold actually moved, where it pooled, where it climbed, what it was afraid of, could stay warm on a fraction of the wood any cabin in the valley would burn. They called it the rambling of someone who had read too many books and built too few walls. He did not argue. He took his tools and walked up the hill. Now the smoke kept rising, and the settlement was 3 weeks into a winter that would go on record in what local accounts describe as the coldest early season that valley had seen in living memory. Something had worked up there, something no one in the valley fully understood yet, or was ready to admit they needed to understand. But winter has a way of making people reconsider. If you've ever wondered whether the old ways of building actually worked, or just looked good on paper, stay with us. Subscribe and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. We want to know how cold it gets where you are. His name was Caleb Morrow, not a name that appears in any county deed from that region, which is itself telling. Oral account from descendants of that settlement refer to him only as the Stone Man, or, in one recorded interview from the early 20th century, simply as the one who knew the rock. For the purposes of this story, we will call him Caleb, because the shape of the man is clear even when the paperwork is not. He had arrived at the settlement in the late spring of that year, traveling alone from the east with a mule, a sledge, and a reputation that preceded him by about 2 weeks. Word had come from a trading post 70 miles back that a man was heading their way who claimed he could build a shelter out of hillside stone that would outlast any timber cabin in a hard winter. The trading post operator, according to a letter preserved in a regional archive, had added a single editorial line at the bottom: "Take his ideas with salt, but watch what he does with his hands." Caleb was not a young man. He was somewhere past 50, with the kind of posture that comes from decades of lifting stone, slightly forward at the shoulders, deliberate in every step, as though the ground itself needed to be assessed before it was trusted. He spoke slowly. He used words like thermal gradient and convective loop without apology, then translated them into plain language without condescension. That combination, technical precision followed by patient explanation, is exactly the kind of thing that makes certain communities uneasy. It sounds like superiority dressed up as teaching. He had learned stonework as a young man in the Appalachian foothills, where an older builder, a man who had spent years studying the construction methods of both indigenous earthwork shelters and early colonial stone farmhouses, had passed along a body of knowledge that was already considered old-fashioned by the time Caleb received it. The core of that knowledge was simple. Rock does not just block cold. Under the right conditions, rock stores heat and releases it slowly, long after a fire has gone cold. A wall of dense stone 3 feet thick will still be radiating warmth 12 hours after the last ember dies. A wall of green timber 3 feet thick will be cold to the touch within 2. He had built shelters like this before, or modified natural formations into functioning thermal refuges. In at least 2 locations further east, if oral accounts are accurate. Both had survived winters that destroyed newer, better-supplied structures nearby. He had not become famous for this. He had simply moved on. When he arrived at the valley settlement and looked at what the families had built, green-cut pine walls, single-skin construction, fireplaces positioned against exterior walls where the stone mass sat exposed to outside wind, he said very little at first. He walked the perimeter of the settlement for 2 days. He studied the hillside. He tapped rocks with a steel pick and listened to the sound they made. Then he asked to speak at the council meeting. What he proposed was not a replacement for the existing cabins. He was not that reckless. He proposed a single, supplemental structure, a cave refuge cut into the natural stone of the hillside, modified and sealed, with a precisely positioned entry tunnel and a small internal firebox that could serve as a backup shelter and heat anchor for the whole community if the winter turned severe. He estimated it would take him 6 to 8 weeks of solo work. He asked for nothing in return except the right to live in it afterward. The council deliberated for less than an hour. The primary objection was not engineering, it was credibility. Caleb had no local history, no family ties, no land stake. He was an outsider proposing to spend the community's most critical pre-winter weeks doing something no one could verify or supervise in a location they couldn't easily monitor. One council member, according to a descendant's recollection, put it plainly, "If the man is wrong, we've lost nothing but time. But if he convinces families to depend on that hillside instead of their own stoves, we've lost something we can't get back." The vote to expel him from the settlement, not violently, not cruelly, but formally and finally, passed by 9 votes to 3. Caleb Morrow thanked them for their time, collected his mule and his tools, and walked up the hill. He did not look back. That detail, at least, is something every account agrees on. The formation Caleb had chosen was not dramatic. That was, in fact, precisely why he had chosen it. A dramatic cave, the kind with a wide mouth, high ceilings, visible from a distance, would have been useless to him. A wide opening bleeds warmth the same way an open window does. High ceilings create vertical convection. Warm air rises, cold air floods in at the base, and the occupant sits in the coldest layer of the room. Dramatic caves, Caleb understood, were shelters for people who had never seriously tried to stay warm in one. What he had found was a natural overhang of dense sandstone on the eastern slope of the hillside, roughly at the elevation where the soil shifted from topsoil to bedrock. The formation created a horizontal recess about 14 feet deep, 8 feet wide, and 5.5 feet tall at its highest interior point. The ceiling was continuous stone. 3 sides were stone. The fourth, the opening, faced slightly south of east, away from the prevailing northwest wind, which in that valley funneled down from a gap in the ridge line with particular ferocity in the winter months. The orientation was not an accident. Caleb had spent 2 full days reading the hillside before he made a mark on it. He had watched where frost formed earliest in the mornings, which told him where cold air pooled overnight. He had watched where the snow surface was disturbed by wind, which told him the direction and pattern of the dominant gusts. He had found the place on the slope where the rock face was in partial shadow during the coldest hours but received direct afternoon sun, a detail that sounds minor but matters enormously when you understand that even weak winter sunlight striking a dark stone surface for 3 or 4 hours can deposit meaningful warmth into a mass that will release it slowly through the night. He began working in early August. The first task was excavation, not of the cave itself, which already existed, but of the entrance tunnel. This was the decision that would have looked strangest to any observer. Instead of widening the opening to make entry easier, Caleb narrowed it. He built up the entrance walls with dry-stacked sandstone pulled from the slope, reducing the opening to roughly 20 inches wide and 36 inches tall. A grown man had to turn sideways and duck to enter. It looked, by any conventional measure, like a poor design choice. It was not. A narrow, low entrance is one of the oldest thermal management strategies in vernacular architecture, appearing independently in everything from Inuit snow shelters to Mongolian earthwork dwellings to the semi-subterranean pit houses of the ancestral Puebloans in the American Southwest. The physics are straightforward. Cold air is denser than warm air. Given a large opening, cold air will flow freely along the floor, while warm air escapes from the top, and the interior temperature equalizes rapidly with the outside. A small, low opening restricts that cold air infiltration dramatically. The warm interior air, less dense, tends to stay stratified above the cold entry zone. The result is a shelter that behaves more like a sealed container than an open room. Beyond the entrance tunnel, Caleb built a small antechamber, a transitional space about 3 feet deep, walled on 3 sides before the main living area. This served as an airlock of sorts, a dead air buffer that further reduced the thermal exchange between outside and inside each time someone entered or exited. It added perhaps 4 hours of construction time. It would prove worth far more than that. Inside the main chamber, he spent 3 weeks on a single task that required more patience than skill. Filling every crack, every joint, every gap in the natural stone ceiling and walls with a mortar he mixed himself from local clay, ash from a small fire, and crushed limestone aggregate. The goal was not structural. The stone was not going anywhere. The goal was to eliminate air infiltration. Coal does not teleport through solid rock. It travels through air. Seal the air paths, and you slow the cold to a crawl. The floor was the last thing he addressed, and his approach here surprised even the physics. Rather than leaving bare stone, which would have been cold underfoot but otherwise adequate, he laid a 4-inch bed of compacted ash over the entire floor surface. Wood ash is a remarkable insulator. It has extremely low thermal conductivity, meaning it transfers heat slowly in either direction. A floor of compacted ash stays warmer than stone, does not wick moisture, and provides a surface that can be easily releveled and replaced. It is also free, abundant, and weightless to transport. Caleb had been collecting ash from his small work fire for weeks before laying it. By the middle of September, the structure was sealed, floored, and functional. He had not yet built the firebox. That would come last, and it would be the most consequential decision of all. Before Caleb lit his first fire inside the hillside, the stone around him was already working. This is the part that requires the most careful explanation. Not because it is complicated, but because it runs directly against the way most people instinctively think about heat and shelter. The common assumption is that a shelter is warm because something inside it produces heat. A stove burns. A fireplace radiates. A body generates metabolic warmth. Take those sources away, and the shelter goes cold. That assumption is true for thin-walled structures. It is only partially true for structures with high thermal mass. Thermal mass is the capacity of material to absorb, store, and slowly release heat energy. It is a function of density, specific heat capacity, and volume. Dense, heavy materials, stone, brick, rammed earth, packed clay, have high thermal mass. Light, porous materials, timber framing, insulation bats, hollow partition walls have low thermal mass. The critical difference is not just how much heat they can hold, but how slowly they release it. A material with high thermal mass acts as a thermal battery. Charge it with heat, and it will discharge that heat slowly over many hours, long after the heat source has been removed. The sandstone formation Caleb had chosen had been accumulating solar energy since the first warm days of spring. A south-facing stone face in a temperate climate receives somewhere between 200 and 400 BTUs of solar radiation per square foot per day during the summer months, depending on latitude and cloud cover. Over 5 months of warm weather, the rock mass surrounding the cave had absorbed a meaningful thermal charge, not enough to heat the space dramatically on its own, but enough to establish a baseline interior temperature significantly above the outside ambient air. Caleb had measured this, in his own way, before he began construction. He had pushed a wooden stake into the soil at the base of the rock formation and checked it at dawn each morning for a week. The soil temperature at 6 inches depth remained between 48 and 52 degrees Fahrenheit, even as early September mornings outside dropped into the upper 30s. The rock itself, at its interior surface, held steady at what he estimated, pressing his palm flat against it for a slow count, to be somewhere around 55 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside air temperature that same morning, 34 degrees Fahrenheit. 20 degrees of free warmth. Already there, already waiting, provided by nothing except mass, time, and the physics of how stone interacts with sunlight. This phenomenon has a formal name in modern building science: ground-coupled thermal stability. Structures built into or against significant earth and rock mass tend to maintain interior temperatures within a much narrower range than above-ground, thin-wall structures. The earth itself acts as a thermal buffer, dampening the extremes in both directions. In summer, a cave stays cool because the rock has not yet shed its winter cold. In winter, a cave stays warm because the rock has not yet shed its summer heat. The lag between surface temperature and rock mass temperature, sometimes called the thermal phase shift, can be measured in weeks or even months for deep formations. What Caleb's valley neighbors were doing, by contrast, was building thin-walled timber shelters that had essentially no thermal mass at all. Green-cut pine walls, even 12 inches thick, have a fraction of the heat storage capacity of an equivalent thickness of sandstone. The interior of a timber cabin heats up quickly when the fire is burning and cools down just as quickly when it is not. A family sleeping through the night was fighting a losing battle. The fire died down. The walls gave up their meager stored warmth within an hour or two, and by 4 in the morning the interior temperature had essentially equalized with the outside. In Caleb's shelter, the process worked in reverse. Every fire he lit deposited heat, not just into the air of the cave, which was relatively small in volume, but into the surrounding rock. A sandstone wall does not glow like iron. It does not radiate heat in visible waves. But press your hand against a stone wall that has been warmed by a fire, even after the fire has been cold for 6 hours, and you will feel the warmth pushing back against your palm. Slowly, patiently, without urgency. That patience was the point. A standard open fireplace of the period, a single-face design, central hearth, standard masonry, capture perhaps 10 to 15% of the combustion energy as useful room heat. The rest went up the chimney. Convective losses, radiation losses, draft losses. A well-managed fire in such a hearth burned through a cord of hardwood, roughly 128 cubic feet of stacked wood, in 6 to 8 weeks during a hard winter, depending on family size and management. Caleb's firebox, when he finally built it, was designed around a fundamentally different principle. Not to heat air, to heat stone. The firebox Caleb built was small by any standard of the period. Most settlers, when they thought of a proper fireplace, imagined something generous: a wide hearth opening, room to stand beside, a mantel above, a fire visible from across the room. The visual comfort of a large, open flame was not considered a luxury. It was considered evidence that the shelter was being properly heated. A small fire, a narrow firebox, a restricted draft. These things looked like poverty or poor planning. Caleb's firebox was 22 inches wide, 18 inches tall at the opening, and built entirely within the stone body of the rear wall. It was not designed to be looked at. It was designed to function. The distinction matters more than it sounds. An open hearth loses the majority of its combustion heat through direct radiation out the front opening and through convective draft up the chimney. The fire is visible precisely because the energy is escaping in all directions, including toward the viewer. A firebox that is enclosed on 5 sides, with only a controlled draft opening and a small front aperture, forces the combustion gases to travel through a longer thermal path before exiting. Every additional inch of flue path inside the stone mass is an inch where combustion heat is transferred from gas to rock rather than exhausted to the outside air. The design Caleb used was a simplified version of a principle that would not be formally codified in American building literature for another 50 years, but that had been practiced in various forms across Northern Europe, Scandinavia, and parts of Russia for generations. Local accounts from similar regions describe this type of enclosed stone firebox as a heat core, a combustion chamber designed not to warm a room directly, but to charge the surrounding masonry with stored thermal energy that then radiates outward over many hours. He used a single course of flat sandstone slabs to build the firebox walls, laid without mortar at first to allow him to test and adjust the geometry. The critical measurement was the firebox throat, the narrow passage where combustion gases transition from the fire chamber into the flue channel. Too wide, and draft pulls cold outside air in and hot gases out too quickly, wasting heat. Too narrow, and the fire smothers from insufficient oxygen. Caleb set his throat at approximately 4 inches by 12 inches, a ratio he reportedly described, according to an oral account passed down through a descendant of one of the families he later sheltered, as the width of your hand and the length of your forearm. The flue itself did not exit vertically through the ceiling, which would have been the obvious solution and the standard approach. Instead, it ran horizontally for approximately 30 inches through a channel Caleb chiseled into the rear wall before angling upward and exiting through a natural crack in the rock above the overhang. This horizontal run was the most labor-intensive part of the entire construction, requiring a week of careful chisel work. It was also the most thermally important. A horizontal flue section inside a stone wall functions as a heat exchanger. The hot combustion gases, instead of racing directly upward and out, are forced to travel horizontally through a narrow stone channel. The gas temperature at entry into the horizontal section might be 600 to 700 degrees Fahrenheit. By the time it reaches the vertical exit, the gas has transferred a significant portion of that energy into the surrounding stone. The gas exits cooler. The stone wall exits warmer. That warmth then radiates into the living space for the next 8 to 12 hours, without any additional fire. On the floor, Caleb added one more element that his future visitors would notice and remember. Around the base of the firebox wall, he built a low stone bench, essentially a raised platform of stacked flat stones about 12 inches high and 18 inches deep, running along the 2 side walls closest to the heat core. The bench had no cushion, no finish, no decoration. It was not a seat in the comfortable sense, but it was a thermal surface, a place where the dense stone, warmed from below and behind by the firebox mass, could conduct heat directly into anyone who sat or lay against it. In conditions where the outside air temperature had dropped below 0 degrees Fahrenheit, that conducted warmth was not a comfort, it was medicine. The entry configuration completed the system. The narrow tunnel entrance was oriented slightly downhill, a subtle but deliberate grade, which meant that the coldest air entering at floor level had to travel uphill into the space. Cold air, being denser, resisted that uphill movement naturally. A hanging panel of layered canvas and deer hide, weighted at the bottom with a stone-filled hem, covered the interior face of the entrance and created the final seal. The hide was not airtight. It did not need to be. It needed only to interrupt the convective loop, and it did so effectively. The complete system, when functioning, produced an interior environment that local accounts describe with remarkable consistency across multiple sources. Warmer near the walls and floor than at head height, with almost no drafts, a smell of warm stone and ash rather than smoke, and a silence different from the silence of a timber cabin. Deeper, more mineral, as though the sound itself was being absorbed by the rock. By mid-October, Caleb had burned less than a quarter cord of wood. A comparable timber cabin in the valley, by the same date, had already consumed close to a full cord. He was not surprised. The storm came on a Tuesday. The families in the valley remembered the date precisely, not because anyone had a reason to expect it, but because the speed of the change was so disorienting that it lodged itself in memory the way sudden things do. Monday had been cold but navigable. A hard frost overnight, temperatures rising to the mid-20s by afternoon, a pale sky that offered no particular warning. By Tuesday morning, the temperature had dropped to 4 degrees Fahrenheit before dawn. By Tuesday noon, the wind had come down through the ridge gap at what survivors described as a sustained, unreasonable force, not a gust pattern, but a continuous pressure, as though the air itself had been replaced with something heavier and meaner. The creek froze solid in less than 18 hours. Inside the timber cabins, the response was immediate and exhausting. Every family stoked their fires to maximum capacity, burning wood at a rate none of them had planned for. The problem with green-cut pine in a hard freeze is not that it does not burn. It burns, eventually, but that it burns inefficiently. Freshly cut, wood contains between 30 and 50% moisture by weight. A significant portion of combustion energy goes toward boiling off that moisture before any useful heat is produced. The fire works hard. The room benefits less than expected. Caleb's understanding of wood, like his understanding of stone, went considerably beyond what was common in the settlement. He had spent the summer and early fall not only building a shelter, but also gathering and processing fuel. He had collected dead-standing timber whenever he could find it, trees that had died on their feet and dried in place, with moisture content already reduced to 15 to 20%. He had split the wood small and stacked it inside the cave antechamber in late September, where the ambient warmth of the stone dried it further. By November, his firewood had a moisture content the modern equivalent of kiln-dried stock. Dry wood burns hotter. It produces more complete combustion, more heat per pound, less smoke, and less creosote buildup in the flue. A fire fed with properly dried wood in a well-designed, enclosed firebox is not just more comfortable than a smoky greenwood fire in an open hearth. It is fundamentally more efficient at the level of basic physics. For every pound of wood burned, Caleb was extracting more usable BTUs and depositing more of them into his stone mass. On the first night of the storm, while the settlement families burned through wood at rates approaching double their planned consumption, Caleb lit a moderate fire at dusk, fed it steadily for 4 hours, and allowed it to die down to coals by 10 o'clock. He went to sleep on his stone bench beside a wall that registered, by his palm measurement estimate, approximately 72 degrees Fahrenheit at its surface. The outside air temperature that night fell to -8 degrees Fahrenheit. The interior of his shelter, according to his own account as preserved in oral history, did not drop below 52 degrees Fahrenheit at any point during the night. 52 degrees against -8, a differential of 60 degrees, maintained without an active fire, maintained by rock. In the timber cabins below, families who had let their fires die down for even 2 hours, a common occurrence when exhaustion overcame vigilance, woke to interior temperatures in the low 20s. Pipes froze. Water buckets froze. One family reported finding ice on the interior wall surface by morning. By the third day of the storm, the settlement's wood supply situation had become critical. Several families had burned through enough of their reserves to face a genuine calculation. At current consumption rates, they would exhaust their winter supply before the end of January. The storm showed no sign of breaking, and the smoke from the hillside, steady, patient, thin, was still rising above the frozen valley, visible against a white sky, as it had been every morning since August. The settlement elder called a meeting on the 4th day. It was a short meeting. There was only one item on the agenda, and everyone already knew what it was. They came up the hill in 2 groups. The first group arrived on the morning of the 5th day of the storm. 3 men, led by the settlement elder, a broad-shouldered former mill worker named Harlan Pruitt, who had cast his vote for expulsion without hesitation and had not, by any account, expressed regret about it until now. They carried nothing. They came with their hands visible and their hats in those hands, which in the customs of that time and place was not a small gesture. It meant they were not coming to negotiate. It meant they were coming to ask. The entrance to the shelter was not easy to find if you did not know where to look. The narrow stone opening sat behind a shelf of rock that concealed it from direct line of sight until you were within 20 feet. What guided them up the slope was the smell. Not smoke, exactly, but the mineral warmth that radiates from heated stone and cold air, a scent without a common name, but instantly recognizable to anyone who has ever pressed their face against a sun-warmed boulder in October. That warmth, escaping faintly through the hide curtain at the tunnel mouth, was the only advertisement the shelter made. Harlan Pruitt ducked through the entrance tunnel and straightened, as much as the ceiling allowed, inside the antechamber. The temperature change was immediate and physical. Outside, the air had been sitting at 7 degrees Fahrenheit, driven by a wind that made the effective chill considerably worse. Inside the antechamber, the air was still. Inside the main chamber, beyond the second hide curtain, the temperature registered, by Caleb's own reckoning, at approximately 58 degrees Fahrenheit. No fire was burning. The firebox had been cold since the previous evening. Harlan Pruitt stood in that warmth for a long moment without speaking. Caleb, seated on his stone bench with a book open across his knee, looked up and waited. What passed between them in the next few minutes is reconstructed from oral accounts preserved across 2 generations of descendants, and the details vary depending on who is telling it. What the accounts agree on is this. Harlan Pruitt did not apologize. He explained the situation, the wood consumption rates, the families with children, the storm's persistence, the council's decision. He used the word request rather than demand, which was noted. And Caleb Morrow, who had every reasonable justification for refusing, said yes, with a single condition. Not for payment, not for reinstatement into the settlement. His condition was that he would explain to anyone who wished to understand exactly how the shelter worked and why. He would not be a mystery. He would not be credited with magic. If families are going to survive the winter in a shelter, they're going to understand the physics of why it kept them alive. Harlan Pruitt agreed. He looked around the stone chamber one more time. At the sealed ceiling, the ash floor, the low bench, the narrow firebox built into the rear wall, and shook his head slowly. Not in dismissal, in something closer to recognition of how badly he had misjudged the thing in front of him. The second group came that afternoon. 2 families, 7 people total, including 4 children under the age of 10. They carried their essential belongings wrapped in canvas and arrived at the entrance looking exhausted and, several accounts note this specifically, ashamed. The shame mattered. It was the honest response to arriving at the door of a man you had driven out of your community and finding it not only unlocked but warm. Caleb had already reorganized the interior before they arrived. The stone bench along the 2 side walls could accommodate 6 people sleeping on their sides, pressed against the warm stone. Additional bedding, pine boughs overlaid with hides, had been laid on the ash floor along the wall opposite the firebox. The antechamber, which Caleb had originally used for wood storage, was cleared and relined with boughs to serve as a sleeping area for 2 of the older children, whose smaller body mass made them more vulnerable to cold than the adults. He lit the firebox at dusk, fed it steadily with his seasoned wood for 3 hours, and let it die down to coals by 9 o'clock. By midnight, with 9 human beings inside a space designed for 1, the interior temperature had climbed to 64 degrees Fahrenheit. The walls radiated evenly. The ash floor held the warmth without conducting cold upward. The stone bench, charged from behind by the firebox mass, registered over 70 degrees Fahrenheit at its surface, warm enough that the children sleeping against it had to be covered with a single light blanket rather than multiple layers. Outside, the temperature fell to -12 degrees Fahrenheit before dawn. Inside the hillside, no one woke from cold. Numbers matter in a crisis. Not for their own sake. No one trapped in a hard winter cares about theory, but because numbers are the language of consequence. They are how you measure the gap between what a man claimed was possible and what actually happened when the storm arrived. So let us examine the gap. Over the course of the 6-week period that encompassed the early arrival of winter and the sustained cold that followed, the 12 timber cabins in the valley settlement consumed, by the settlement's own collective accounting, preserved in a supply ledger that one family carried with them when they relocated years later, an average of between 2 and 2.5 cords of wood per household. Several families exhausted their entire pre-winter supply and were forced to cut and burn green wood in January, which reduced their heating efficiency further and accelerated the cycle of overconsumption. Caleb's shelter, over the same 6-week period, including the 3 weeks during which it housed between 7 and 11 people at various intervals, consumed approximately 3/4 of a cord of seasoned wood. Total. That figure deserves to sit by itself for a moment. 3/4 of a cord against an average of 2+ cords, in a space that ultimately sheltered more people through the worst nights. The efficiency ratio, expressed simply, was somewhere between 2.8 and 3.3 times better than the best-performing timber cabin in the valley, and those cabins were each housing a single family with a single stove. The explanation is not mysterious, but it requires understanding how heat loss actually works in a shelter. Heat leaves a building through 3 primary mechanisms: conduction through walls and ceiling, convection through air infiltration, and radiation through openings. Timber walls, even thick ones, have a relatively high rate of thermal conductance. A green pine wall conducts heat from inside to outside at a rate that can drain an actively heated room in 2 to 4 hours when exterior temperatures are below 0 degrees Fahrenheit. Stone walls, particularly dense sandstone of the thickness present in a natural rock formation, conduct heat at a dramatically slower rate. The R value per inch of dense sandstone is lower than modern fiberglass insulation, but the sheer mass of the formation. In Caleb's case, rock depths ranging from 18 inches to several feet on the ceiling and rear wall created an effective thermal resistance that no equivalent timber construction could match. Air infiltration was the second critical factor. A timber cabin built with green lumber will gap and crack as the wood dries and contracts in the cold. Every gap is an air infiltration point. Cold air enters at floor level. Warm air exits at ceiling level. The interior temperature drops continuously, and the fire must compensate constantly. Caleb's sealed stone chamber, with its mortar joints and high-draped low entrance, had air infiltration rates that were a fraction of any timber structure. The fire was not fighting a leak. It was charging a battery. The thermal mass effect produced what the settlement families experienced as something almost disorienting, a shelter that was warmer in the morning, after a fire last night, than it had been when the fire was first lit. This is thermodynamically possible because the stone walls, charged over the previous evening's fire, continue releasing heat into the airspace throughout the night. In a well-insulated, high-mass enclosure with sufficient occupants generating body heat, each adult human body radiates approximately 300 to 400 BTUs per hour at rest. The interior temperature can actually rise slightly in the hours just before dawn, when the combined radiant output of walls and bodies outpaces the slow losses through the entry tunnel. Several of the women sheltering in the cave noted this effect in accounts preserved by their children. They described waking in the early morning hours and finding the air warmer than it had been at midnight, and assuming at first that someone had gotten up to tend the fire. No one had. The stone was still working. It would keep working in decreasing intensity for another 8 to 10 hours before the next evening fire was needed. Compare this to the timber cabin experience, where a family that let the fire die at midnight woke to temperatures in the low 20s by 4 in the morning, a drop of 30 to 40 degrees in 4 hours, and the practical superiority of Caleb's approach becomes not a matter of theoretical preference, but of measurable survival margin. One additional number. Throughout the entire 6-week crisis period, not a single person sheltering in the cave refuge suffered a cold-related injury or illness that required medical intervention. 2 children in the valley cabins developed serious respiratory complications during the same period, which local accounts attribute to the combination of cold exposure during fire-tending lapses and the poor air quality of greenwood smoke in underventilated interiors. The cave had no cases of smoke inhalation. Caleb's horizontal flue design, which extracted the combustion gases through the stone before they entered the living space, produced a fire that was nearly invisible in terms of indoor air quality. The air inside the shelter smelled of stone and ash and human warmth, not of smoke. That was, in the end, the number that the settlement council never put in any ledger, but that every family who spent a night on that stone bench carried with them for the rest of their lives. The winter broke in the 3rd week of February. The creek thawed in segments, cracking and groaning for 2 days before the flow resumed. The ridge gap wind eased. The sky, which had been the flat white of sustained cold for weeks, began to show color again at the edges. A thin line of blue at the horizon that grew each morning by a degree or two, until one afternoon the sun appeared low and genuine above the southern hills, and the snow surface lit up in a way that made people stop what they were doing and stand still. The settlement had survived, barely in some cases, but intact. The families who had sheltered in the cave refuge began returning to their cabins in early February, as temperatures moderated enough to make the valley structures habitable again. They left quietly, one group at a time. Caleb Morrow stayed where he was. He had not been re-invited to the settlement below, and he did not request to be. He had made a condition at the beginning, that he would explain the shelter to anyone who wished to understand it, and he had honored that condition. Over 6 weeks, he had given what amounted to a sustained seminar in vernacular thermal engineering to people who had voted him out as a fraud. They had listened. Most of them had learned. Whether they had the generosity to admit what that meant about the vote they had taken in August is a question the historical record declines to answer directly. What the record does show, through oral accounts, through a single letter written by a settlement woman to her sister in another county and preserved through that family's descendants, is that the techniques Caleb demonstrated did not disappear when the crisis ended. They moved, not loudly, not credited to any single source, but the way practical knowledge moves in isolated communities, through imitation, adaptation, and the quiet authority of demonstrated results. The woman's letter, written in the spring following the hard winter, describes her husband spending the following summer building what she calls a stone back into the north wall of their cabin, a thick internal masonry mass positioned to absorb heat from their existing fireplace and release it slowly overnight. She does not attribute the idea to Caleb by name. She says only that we learned from the hillside what our walls needed to know. In a neighboring valley 20 miles east, oral history collected in the early 20th century describes a family whose root cellar was modified sometime in the 1870s or 1880s to incorporate a small sealed firebox in the rear stone wall, a design that matches Caleb's shelter closely enough to suggest a direct or second-hand transmission of the principle. The cellar reportedly maintained temperatures above freezing through 2 subsequent severe winters without significant wood consumption. 40 miles north, a community of Scandinavian immigrants who had settled in a glacially carved hill country built their first communal shelter as a semi-subterranean stone structure in the early 1880s. Their accounts credit the design to practices brought from Norway and Sweden, which is accurate. Scandinavian earthwork construction has a long and sophisticated history of exactly these techniques. But local oral accounts also mention a stone man from the south who passed through the community in the years before construction and spoke at length with the settlement's chief builder. Whether that was Caleb Morrow, or someone who had learned from him, or a convergent practitioner working from different but parallel traditions, is not possible to determine. What is possible to determine is this: the knowledge did not stay on that hillside. Caleb himself remained in the valley for 3 more winters, expanding and refining the cave Refuge into something that local accounts begin referring to, by the 2nd year, as simply the warm place. He added a second sleeping alcove, extended the flue channel by another 18 inches, and built a proper stone shelf for food storage that maintained temperatures between 38 and 45 degrees Fahrenheit regardless of outside conditions, a function that made it invaluable for the preservation of milk, cheese, and winter vegetables for the families who visited regularly, regardless of whether a crisis was underway. He was never formally readmitted to the settlement. He was never formally excluded from it again, either. After the 3rd winter, he left. His mule was older and slower. He carried the same canvas roll he had arrived with, now considerably more worn. He did not make announcements. He did not leave instructions. The shelter remained on the hillside, sealed and functional, for as long as anyone thought to maintain it, which, according to the last reference in local accounts, was at least 2 more decades. His name, Caleb Morrow, faded from the record quickly. The knowledge outlasted the attribution, which is perhaps the most honest possible summary of how vernacular engineering actually survives. It does not need a name attached to it. It needs only to work under real conditions, in front of people who are cold enough to pay attention. Stand inside a modern, well-insulated house on a cold night and consider what is actually keeping you warm. The answer, in most residential construction built in the last 70 years, is continuous mechanical energy. A furnace burning natural gas or heating oil, or a heat pump drawing electrical power, running in cycles throughout the night, turning on when the thermostat drops below the set point, heating the air, turning off, losing ground to infiltration and conductive loss through the walls, turning on again. The typical American forced air system in a conventionally framed house cycles 8 to 12 times per hour during severe cold. Each cycle costs energy. Each pause loses ground. The house is not storing warmth. It is being continuously rewarmed from a source that must never stop. The insulation in the walls, fiberglass bats, mineral wool, foam board, slows the rate of heat loss. It does not store heat. R38 insulation in an attic is not a thermal battery. It is a thermal resistor. It slows the flow of heat outward, but once the heating system stops, the house begins cooling immediately. In a power outage on a night when temperatures fall to -10 degrees Fahrenheit, a well-insulated modern home with no backup heat source will drop to unlivable temperatures within 12 to 18 hours. Pipes freeze. The interior temperature equalizes toward the outside. Caleb's shelter, under equivalent conditions, would have maintained habitable temperatures for 36 to 48 hours without any fire at all, provided the stone mass had been adequately charged in the preceding days. The difference between 12 hours and 48 hours is not a comfort margin. It is the difference between a solvable problem and a survival crisis. This is not an argument against modern insulation, which is a genuine engineering advancement. It is an argument for recognizing that insulation and thermal mass are not the same tool, and that the wholesale abandonment of mass-based construction in favor of light-frame, insulated building has created a housing stock that is extraordinarily dependent on continuous energy supply. The irony is sharp. The people who built with stone were considered primitive. Their structures were heavy, labor-intensive, and required skills that took years to develop. Modern construction is faster, lighter, cheaper per square foot, and accessible to builders without specialized training. These are real advantages. But the thermal behavior of a well-built stone or earthwork structure, its ability to buffer temperature swings, to release stored heat through the night, to maintain habitability through extended heating failures, represents a form of passive resilience that modern light frame construction simply cannot replicate. Contemporary passive house design, with its emphasis on airtight envelopes, thermal bridging elimination, and heat recovery ventilation, approaches the performance of high-mass vernacular construction through different means. The best passive house projects today achieve heating energy consumption figures, measured in kBTU per square foot per year, that would have impressed Caleb Morrow, though the methods are entirely different. The shared underlying principle, however, is identical. Reduce the rate at which heat escapes the living space, and you reduce the energy required to maintain livable conditions. What neither passive house design nor conventional insulated framing fully replicates is the thermal inertia of a structure embedded in geological mass. A house sitting on a slab or crawl space is thermally decoupled from the earth. The ground beneath it is a reservoir of stable temperature, between 50 and 58 degrees Fahrenheit at 4 to 6 feet depth in most temperate climates, that the house cannot access. That reservoir is free. It is inexhaustible on a human timescale. It was the primary thermal asset of every earth-sheltered, semi-subterranean, and cave-modified shelter built by every culture that faced serious winter on this continent or any other. Caleb Morrow did not invent this. The indigenous peoples of the Great Plains built earth lodges with semi-subterranean floors that used ground-coupled thermal stability as a primary heating strategy. The ancestral Puebloans built cliff dwellings in south-facing stone faces that moderated temperature swings through both solar mass and geological coupling. The Norse settlers of Greenland built longhouses with turf roofs 3 feet thick, not for appearance, but for thermal mass and insulation simultaneously. The Barabara shelters of the Onangan people of the Aleutian Islands were earthwork structures that maintained habitable interior temperatures through sub-zero storms that would have destroyed a comparably sized timber structure. Every culture that survived a serious winter eventually arrived at the same understanding. The earth is not your enemy. It is a slow, patient, inexhaustible source of thermal stability. The question was never whether you could use it. The question was only whether you understood enough to ask. Caleb Morrow understood. He went up a hill with a chisel and a canvas roll and proceeded to demonstrate, at the cost of a winter's isolation and a community's contempt, that the answer had been sitting in the rock face all along. There is a particular kind of knowledge that does not survive in documents. It does not end up in building codes or engineering manuals or university curricula. It does not get attributed to a named inventor or patented by a company or taught in a formal sequence of courses. It lives instead in the choices people make when they are cold enough to need real answers. In the way a man positions a firebox before anyone told him to, in the way a woman builds a stone back into her cabin wall without writing down why, in the way a community 40 miles away constructs a shelter that looks, from the outside, like something brought from a distant country, but that uses the same physics in the same configuration for the same reasons. Caleb Morrow's shelter stood on that hillside for 2 decades after he left. The families of the settlement used it as a cold storage annex, a lambing shelter in late winter storms, a refuge for anyone who needed to ride out a sudden temperature drop before they could make it back to the valley. It was known, without ceremony, as the warm place. Nobody put a plaque on it. Nobody published an account of how it worked. The knowledge of its construction existed in the hands and memories of the people who had watched Caleb build it and had asked, during the long cold weeks of that first crisis winter, the questions he had insisted they ask. Those questions were specific. Where does the cold air enter? What does the warm air pool? How long does this stone hold heat after the fire dies? What is the minimum fire needed to charge the mass adequately for a full night? How do you know when the stone is fully charged? How do you read the temperature of a surface with your hand when you have no instrument? These are not abstract questions. They are engineering questions, practical, measurable, answerable through direct observation. Caleb answered every one of them, in plain language, to people who had called his ideas dangerous nonsense 4 months earlier. He did not express bitterness about the irony. He expressed, according to every account that touches on his character during those weeks, a kind of focused patience, the patience of a man who has spent a lifetime knowing something that others do not yet believe, and who has learned that the most effective argument is a warm room in a cold storm. The broader lesson is one that every generation seems required to relearn. Vernacular building knowledge, the accumulated thermal wisdom of people who built without the safety net of continuous energy supply, was not primitive. It was not a placeholder for the real solutions that would come later. It was a different engineering tradition, one optimized for passive performance, material efficiency, and resilience under resource constraint. It took centuries to develop. It was abandoned in most of the industrialized world within a few decades of the mid-20th century, as cheap energy made continuous mechanical heating so inexpensive that the energy cost of a drafty, thin-walled house became trivial. That era of cheap, reliable energy is not guaranteed to continue. Every serious conversation about grid resilience, energy security, and climate-driven extreme weather eventually arrives at the same uncomfortable recognition. A housing stock that is entirely dependent on continuous energy supply is a housing stock that is fragile in ways that the people who live in it rarely think about until the power is out, the pipes are frozen, and the temperature inside their well-insulated. Our 38 ceiling mechanically ventilated home has dropped 40 degrees in 12 hours. Caleb Morrow would have understood the problem immediately. He would have walked the perimeter for 2 days, tapping the walls and listening. He would have found the hillside. He would have started chiseling. And he would have done it alone, if necessary, because he understood something that the people who voted him out had not yet learned, that the physics of heat storage does not require consensus. It requires only the patience to work with what the earth has already put in place. The smoke is still rising from somewhere on that hillside, if you know where to look for it. Thin, steady, unhurried, as though whatever is burning up there has no reason to rush. This script is a fully dramatized reconstruction based on vernacular engineering principles, oral history methodology, and regional historical accounts of frontier construction. All characters, names, and specific events are reconstructed narratively and should not be treated as verified historical record. Physical and thermal principles described reflect real-world building science. This content does not substitute for professional engineering, construction, or safety guidance.